On the morning of November 3rd, 1983, a custodian named Raymond Torres was emptying trash bins in the parking garage of a suburban office complex in Tysons Corner, Virginia, approximately 12 miles west of Washington, D.C., when he noticed something unusual wedged between a concrete parking barrier and the garage floor. It was a brown leather wallet, worn at the edges and slightly damp from the previous night's rain. Most people in Torres's position would have done exactly what he did. He picked it up, opened it to check for identification, and immediately began looking for a way to return it to its owner. What he couldn't have known, what no one could have known at that moment, was that this simple act of returning a lost wallet would unravel one of the most successful Soviet intelligence operations running on American soil and expose a deep cover agent who had been living under a false identity for nearly 11 years. The wallet contained the usual items: a Virginia driver's license in the name of Daniel Robert Chambers, a Visa card, an American Express card, a Safeway grocery store membership card, $43 in cash, and a business card identifying the owner as a systems analyst at a defense contractor called Advanced Technical Solutions. There was also a small photograph, slightly faded, showing a woman and two children at what appeared to be a beach somewhere, the kind of snapshot that millions of Americans carried in their wallets without giving it a second thought. Torres, who had worked as a custodian at the Tysons Corner office complex for 6 years, was familiar with the routine for handling lost property. He took the wallet to the building's main security desk, logged it in the lost and found register, and informed the security supervisor that someone had left their wallet in the parking garage. The security supervisor, a former Arlington County police officer named Michael Brennan, took the wallet and made a note of Torres's report. Under normal circumstances, he would have simply placed it in the lost property drawer and waited for the owner to call or come by to claim it. But something about the situation prompted him to take an additional step, a step that would prove to be the first thread in unraveling Daniel Chambers's carefully constructed life. Brennan noticed that the driver's license showed an address in McLean, Virginia, a wealthy suburb populated largely by government officials, lawyers, and professionals working in the Washington area. The photograph on the license showed a man in his late 30s with dark hair, glasses, and the kind of unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd. But what caught Brennan's attention was the business card. Advanced Technical Solutions was one of several companies that leased office space in the building, and Brennan knew from his daily interactions with employees that ATS held contracts with the Department of Defense and required many of its staff to maintain security clearances. Someone with a security clearance losing their wallet was not necessarily a security issue, but it was the kind of thing that companies like ATS took seriously. Brennan decided to call the company directly rather than waiting for Chambers to report the wallet missing. At approximately 10:15 that morning, he reached the main switchboard at Advanced Technical Solutions and asked to be connected to Daniel Chambers. The receptionist put him on hold for nearly 2 minutes before returning to inform him that there was no employee by that name currently working at the company. Brennan, assuming he'd simply reached the wrong department or that Chambers worked for a different firm in the building, described the business card he'd found in the wallet. The receptionist asked him to hold again, and this time when she returned, her tone had changed. She asked Brennan to wait on the line and transferred him to the company's security department. The man who picked up the phone identified himself as Robert Haskins, Director of Corporate Security for Advanced Technical Solutions. Brennan explained the situation, described the wallet, and read off the information from the business card. There was a long pause before Haskins responded, and when he did, his questions were specific and careful. What time had the wallet been found? Exactly where in the parking garage? Had anyone else handled it besides Torres and Brennan? Did Brennan remember seeing anyone unusual in the garage the previous evening or early that morning? The conversation lasted approximately 10 minutes, and by the end of it, Brennan understood that something more significant than a simple lost wallet situation was unfolding. Haskins asked him not to discuss the wallet with anyone else and said that someone from ATS Security would be down to the main desk within the hour to retrieve it. Haskins also requested that Brennan write down everything he could remember about finding the wallet, including the exact location and any observations about its condition or contents. When Haskins arrived at the security desk 45 minutes later, he was accompanied by another man who was not introduced by name, but who carried himself with the kind of alert, assessing manner that Brennan, as a former police officer, immediately recognized as law enforcement or military. The two men took possession of the wallet, had Brennan sign a chain of custody document that seemed far more formal than the situation required, and thanked him for his diligence. Then they left, carrying the wallet in a clear plastic evidence bag. What Brennan didn't know, what he wouldn't learn for several more years, was that the business card in Daniel Chambers's wallet was a forgery, and that Advanced Technical Solutions had never employed anyone by that name. The card had been professionally printed, indistinguishable from legitimate ATS business cards in every detail except one. The phone number listed on the card, while it had the correct area code and prefix for the Tysons Corner area, was not connected to Advanced Technical Solutions' actual phone system. It was a number that would have rung to an answering service, a carefully constructed element of a legend designed to provide plausible professional credentials for a man who was not who he claimed to be. Robert Haskins, the director of security who had taken possession of the wallet, was indeed an employee of Advanced Technical Solutions, but his primary loyalty was not to his corporate employer. Since 1979, Haskins had been serving as an FBI informant, one of dozens of security directors at defense contractors who had been quietly recruited to report any suspicious activities, unexplained security breaches, or anomalies that might suggest espionage or unauthorized access to classified materials. The business card with the wrong phone number, combined with the fact that no Daniel Chambers worked for the company, was exactly the kind of anomaly Haskins had been trained to recognize. Within 2 hours of taking possession of the wallet, Haskins had contacted his FBI handler, Special Agent Catherine Morrison, who worked out of the Bureau's Washington field office on 4th Street. Morrison had been handling counterintelligence cases since 1976 and had developed a particular expertise in identifying deep-cover Soviet illegals, intelligence officers, who entered the United States under false identities and lived seemingly normal American lives while conducting espionage operations. The initial assessment was cautious. A forged business card and a fake employment claim could mean many things. It could be someone running a con, someone engaged in corporate espionage, someone with a criminal background trying to establish a false identity for financial fraud. But the location mattered. Tysons Corner, Virginia, in the early 1980s, was a rapidly developing commercial area that had become home to numerous defense contractors, government agencies, and firms working on classified projects. It was exactly the kind of environment where a Soviet intelligence officer might position himself to gain access to sensitive information through social engineering, recruitment of assets, or exploitation of security vulnerabilities. Morrison ran the name Daniel Robert Chambers through FBI databases, looking for any previous flags or investigations. She checked immigration records, looking for entry points and visa applications. She ran the Social Security number from the driver's license through the Social Security Administration's verification system, and with each check, the profile of Daniel Chambers began to look increasingly suspicious. The Social Security number had been issued in Maryland in 1961, which would have made Chambers approximately 40 years old, consistent with the age shown in the driver's license photograph. But when Morrison requested the original application documents from the Social Security Administration, she discovered something interesting. The handwriting on the application, which should have been filled out by a young person in 1961, showed characteristics that a forensic document examiner would later identify as being inconsistent with the penmanship taught in American schools during the 1950s. The letter forms were subtly different, the spacing was unusual, and certain abbreviations were written in ways that suggested the writer had learned English as a second language. The driver's license presented another problem. Virginia DMV records showed that Daniel Chambers had obtained his license in 1973, claiming residency at an address in Falls Church. But when Morrison sent agents to verify the address, they discovered it had been a boarding house that was demolished in 1979 to make way for a shopping center. The landlord who had owned the property was deceased, and records of residence from that era were incomplete or lost. The credit cards in the wallet led to accounts that had been opened in 1975 and 1976 respectively, both with payment histories that showed consistent, on-time payments and moderate balances. The accounts were real, the credit was legitimate, but the person using them appeared to be a ghost, someone who had constructed a financial identity without having an authentic personal history to back it up. By November 7th, 4 days after the wallet had been found, the FBI had opened a formal counterintelligence investigation, designated Operation Nomad, focused on identifying who Daniel Chambers really was and what he was doing in Northern Virginia. The investigation team, led by Special Agent Morrison and including 6 other agents from the Washington Field Office's Counterintelligence Division, began the painstaking process of reconstructing Chambers's life and movements. The address on the driver's license, a townhouse in McLean, was placed under surveillance. FBI agents in unmarked vehicles began watching the residence, documenting when lights turned on and off, when vehicles arrived or departed, who came and went. They photographed everyone who approached the townhouse and ran license plates of any vehicles that parked in the driveway or on the street nearby. For the first 3 days of surveillance, the townhouse appeared to be unoccupied. No lights came on at night, no vehicles were present, no one entered or exited. But on the evening of November 10th, at approximately 6:45, a dark blue Chevrolet sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man matching the description from the driver's license photograph got out, carrying a grocery bag and what appeared to be dry cleaning. FBI surveillance teams photographed him from multiple angles as he unlocked the front door and entered the townhouse. Lights came on in the living room and kitchen, and for the next several hours, agents observed normal domestic activity. The man, who they were now tentatively identifying as Daniel Chambers, or whoever was using that identity, appeared to be alone. He moved through the house in ways that surveillance teams described as routine and unremarkable. He watched television, ate dinner, spent time in what appeared to be a home office on the second floor. At approximately 11:30, the lights went out, and the house remained dark through the night. The following morning, at 7:15, Chambers emerged from the townhouse, dressed in business casual attire, got into the Chevrolet, and drove toward Washington. FBI surveillance teams followed him through morning traffic, maintaining careful distance to avoid detection. Chambers drove directly to a parking garage in downtown D.C., parked on the 3rd level, and walked 4 blocks to an office building on K Street. He entered through the main lobby, signed in at the security desk, and took the elevator to the 6th floor. FBI agents who had positioned themselves in the lobby noted the building directory and discovered that the 6th floor housed several businesses, including a consulting firm called Meridian Strategic Group. Further investigation revealed that Meridian Strategic Group was a small firm employing approximately 15 people that provided policy analysis and strategic planning services to corporate clients and occasionally to government agencies. The company had been in operation since 1978 and maintained a low public profile, the kind of firm that did competent work without attracting particular attention or scrutiny. When FBI agents contacted the firm's Human Resources Department under the pretext of conducting a routine employment verification for a security clearance, they were told that Daniel Chambers had been employed as a senior analyst since June of 1980, that his work performance had been satisfactory, and that he held no security clearance through his employment at Meridian. His job primarily involved research and analysis of international trade policy and economic development issues. On the surface, it was legitimate employment at a legitimate company, but the FBI's investigation was beginning to reveal inconsistencies that suggested Daniel Chambers's life was a carefully constructed performance. No one at Meridian Strategic Group seemed to know much about Chambers's personal life. He was described by colleagues as professional but private, someone who completed his work assignments competently but who didn't socialize extensively with other employees. He occasionally attended office gatherings, but he always left early. He never brought guests to company events. He never mentioned family, never displayed photographs in his office, never talked about his background or where he'd grown up. When FBI agents began conducting discreet interviews with Chambers's neighbors in McLean, The same pattern emerged. He was polite but distant, the kind of neighbor who would wave hello and exchange basic pleasantries, but who never engaged in longer conversations. He didn't attend neighborhood association meetings, didn't participate in block parties, didn't form the kinds of casual friendships that typically develop in suburban communities. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Margaret Folsom, told agents that she'd lived next door to Chambers for 2 years and couldn't recall a single substantive conversation they'd ever had beyond discussions about trash pickup schedules and lawn maintenance. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the surveillance reports and the interview summaries and concluded that Chambers was exhibiting classic characteristics of a deep cover operative. He maintained relationships at a level that was friendly enough not to raise suspicion, but shallow enough to prevent anyone from learning details that might contradict his constructed identity. He participated in American life just enough to blend in, but never enough to create deep ties or leave extensive records that could be scrutinized. By late November 1983, the FBI had assembled enough information to conclude with reasonable confidence that Daniel Chambers was likely a Soviet illegal, an intelligence officer living under false identity. But concluding that someone was probably a spy and proving it in a way that would support prosecution were two very different things. The FBI needed evidence of actual espionage activity, not just a suspicious background. The decision was made to escalate surveillance and to begin looking for the operational security mistakes that even the most careful intelligence officers eventually made. FBI technical specialists obtained authorization to install listening devices in Chambers' townhouse, a procedure that required a warrant based on probable cause of espionage activity. The evidence presented to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court included the forged business card, the inconsistencies in Chambers' background, the behavioral patterns consistent with deep cover operations, and analysis from FBI counterintelligence experts who testified that the totality of evidence suggested foreign intelligence activity. The warrant was granted on November 28, 1983, and over the Thanksgiving weekend, while Chambers was away from his townhouse for reasons that surveillance could not determine, FBI technical specialists entered the residence and installed audio monitoring equipment in the living room, home office, and bedroom. The devices were sophisticated, state-of-the-art for that era, designed to transmit to a monitoring station the FBI had established in a rented apartment 3 blocks away. For the next 6 weeks, FBI agents listened to the mundane sounds of Daniel Chambers' daily life. They heard him watching television news, heard him on the phone, making appointments with his dentist, heard him typing on what sounded like a typewriter in his home office. They heard him cooking meals, showering, moving through his routine with the consistency of someone who had settled into a comfortable pattern. But on January 11, 1984, the audio surveillance captured something different. Chambers had a visitor. The first time in 6 weeks of monitoring that anyone had come to the townhouse. The visitor arrived at approximately 7:30 in the evening, and the audio surveillance captured the sound of the doorbell. Chambers greeting someone he addressed only as Michael, and the two men moving into the living room where their conversation could be monitored. What followed was 43 minutes of dialogue that the FBI would later describe as one of the most significant counterintelligence intercepts of the decade. The two men spoke in English, but their conversation was careful, elliptical, full of the kind of indirect language that people use when they're discussing sensitive matters and trying to avoid specifics. They talked about deliveries that needed to be made, about material that had been collected, about schedules that needed to be coordinated. At one point, the visitor, Michael, mentioned that the situation with the procurement documents had been resolved and that the contact at the facility had provided the updated specifications. Chambers responded by saying that the package would need to be ready by the end of the month and that the usual location would work for the transfer. The language was vague enough to be deniable, but the context was unmistakable to trained counterintelligence analysts. This was tradecraft language, the kind of coded conversation that intelligence officers used when discussing espionage operations. The FBI immediately activated visual surveillance on the visitor. photographing him as he left Chambers's townhouse at approximately 8:15 and following him as he drove away in a Honda Accord. The license plate came back registered to a Michael Thomas Brennan, no relation to the security supervisor who had found the wallet, who lived in Alexandria and worked as a contracts administrator at a Navy facility in Arlington. The discovery of a second individual, potentially another Soviet asset or possibly Chambers's handler, opened an entirely new dimension to the investigation. The FBI now had to determine not just who Daniel Chambers was, but how extensive his network might be and what information was being passed to Soviet intelligence. The investigation expanded dramatically. Michael Brennan's background was scrutinized with the same intensity that had been applied to Chambers. His employment history, his financial records, his travel patterns, his associations, everything was examined for evidence of espionage activity or connections to foreign intelligence services. By late January, the FBI had identified what appeared to be a monthly pattern of meetings between Chambers and Brennan, always at Chambers's townhouse, always in the evening, always following the same careful protocol. The audio surveillance of these meetings revealed ongoing discussions about deliveries and materials, and FBI analysts concluded that Brennan was likely providing classified documents from his work at the Navy facility to Chambers, who was then passing them to Soviet intelligence through methods that remained unclear. The challenge facing the FBI was how to catch both men in the act of espionage in a way that would provide evidence sufficient for prosecution. They needed to observe the actual transfer of classified documents, needed to catch Chambers in the act of passing materials to a Soviet handler, needed to build a case that would withstand the scrutiny of a federal trial. The opportunity came on February 24, 1984, when audio surveillance captured Chambers and Brennan discussing an upcoming transfer. Chambers mentioned that the schedule had been moved up and that the delivery would need to happen this weekend instead of next month. He referenced the usual spot in the park, which FBI analysts interpreted as a dead drop location, a prearranged place where materials could be left by one person and picked up by another without the two ever making direct contact. FBI counterintelligence teams began intensive surveillance of parks in the Northern Virginia area, looking for any location where Chambers might have established a dead drop site. They focused on Rock Creek Park, a large urban park that stretched through Washington, D.C. and into Maryland, a location that had been used historically by Soviet intelligence for dead drops because of its size, its accessibility, and the difficulty of maintaining comprehensive surveillance across its extensive trail system. On the evening of February 25th, a Saturday, FBI surveillance teams observed Daniel Chambers leaving his townhouse at approximately 6:30, dressed in casual clothing and carrying a small backpack. He drove to a parking area near the Maryland border section of Rock Creek Park, parked his car, and began walking along one of the main trails. FBI agents on foot, dressed as joggers and hikers, maintained surveillance from a distance, using radio communications to coordinate their positions and ensure that Chambers remained in sight without becoming aware that he was being followed. Chambers walked for approximately 20 minutes, following the trail as it wound through heavily wooded areas, before turning onto a smaller side path that led to a picnic area rarely used during winter months. He approached a specific picnic table, one of several in the area, and sat down as if resting. FBI agents watching through binoculars from concealed positions approximately 80 yards away saw him reach into his backpack, remove what appeared to be a plastic container roughly the size of a shoebox, and place it under the picnic table bench, wedging it carefully between the ground and the underside of the seat. He remained at the table for approximately 3 more minutes, apparently to ensure that no one was watching, and then stood up and walked back toward the main trail. The backpack, which had been full when he arrived, was now visibly flatter. FBI teams did not move to retrieve the container immediately. The operational plan was to observe who came to collect it, to identify Chambers' handler or the courier who served as an intermediary. They maintained surveillance on the picnic area through the evening and into the night, agents rotating positions to avoid fatigue and maintain alertness. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, a man approached the picnic area on foot, coming from a different direction than the main trail. FBI agents, equipped with night vision equipment, photographed him as he went directly to the picnic table, reached under the bench, retrieved the plastic container, and placed it in a shoulder bag he was carrying. He then walked quickly back the way he'd come, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he knew exactly where he was going and wanted to minimize his time in the area. FBI surveillance teams followed him to a parking area, nearly half a mile away, where he got into a vehicle with diplomatic license plates registered to the Soviet embassy. The identification was definitive. Chambers had just delivered materials to a Soviet intelligence officer, completing a dead drop operation that the FBI had observed from beginning to end. The decision was made immediately to move toward arrests, but the FBI wanted to identify what documents Chambers had passed and to understand the full scope of the network he was operating. The following week, FBI agents executed a carefully coordinated operation. On March 2, 1984, Daniel Chambers was arrested as he arrived at work at Meridian Strategic Group. The arrest was conducted quietly, without dramatic confrontation, by agents who simply approached him in the parking garage, identified themselves, and informed him that he was being taken into federal custody on suspicion of espionage. Chambers's initial reaction, according to the arrest report, was silence. He said nothing, made no attempt to resist, simply allowed himself to be handcuffed and placed in an FBI vehicle. Simultaneously, agents arrested Michael Brennan at his home in Alexandria and executed search warrants on both Chambers's townhouse and Brennan's residence. What they found confirmed the investigation's conclusions and revealed the extent of the operation. In Chambers's townhouse, hidden in a false panel behind a bookshelf in his home office, agents discovered materials that included a shortwave radio capable of receiving encrypted transmissions from Soviet intelligence, a Minox camera used for photographing documents, one-time cipher pads for encoding messages, and a Soviet passport in a different name showing that the man known as Daniel Chambers was actually Pyotr Maximovich Kuznetsov, a KGB officer who had been inserted into the United States in 1972. In Brennan's residence, agents found approximately 40 photocopied documents, all classified at levels ranging from confidential to secret, relating to Navy procurement programs, ship maintenance schedules, and technical specifications for communications equipment. Brennan had been systematically photographing classified materials from his work at the Navy facility and passing them to Kuznetsov during their monthly meetings. The investigation revealed that Kuznetsov had been operating in the United States for nearly 12 years, living as Daniel Chambers, working at jobs that provided cover and access to professional communities where he could identify and cultivate potential assets. He had recruited Brennan in 1981, exploiting the man's financial problems and personal grievances to convince him to provide classified information in exchange for money that was paid in cash during their meetings. The case against both men was overwhelming. Kuznetsov, despite being offered the opportunity to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, refused to provide any information about his intelligence activities or his handlers. He invoked his rights, requested an attorney, and maintained complete silence throughout his interrogation. Brennan, faced with the evidence of his betrayal and the prospect of spending decades in federal prison, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. His confession revealed that over the course of 3 years, he had provided Kuznetsov with more than 200 classified documents, information that Soviet military planners had used to understand American naval capabilities and develop countermeasures. The damage assessment conducted by Navy counterintelligence concluded that while Brennan had not had access to the most highly classified programs, the cumulative effect of his espionage had been significant, compromising information about maintenance procedures, equipment specifications, and operational schedules that the Soviet Navy could exploit. Both men were charged under the Espionage Act. Kuznetsov, whose true identity was confirmed through fingerprint analysis and cooperation from Allied intelligence services, was tried in federal court in the Eastern District of Virginia in October 1984. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting the evidence recovered from his townhouse, the surveillance documentation of the dead drop operation, and testimony from FBI agents and counterintelligence analysts. Kuznetsov's defense attorney argued that his client had diplomatic immunity as a representative of a foreign government, but the court rejected this claim on the grounds that Kuznetsov had entered the United States under false pretenses and had engaged in espionage activities that stripped him of any protections he might have otherwise claimed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Kuznetsov was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his espionage activities and the court's assessment that he had operated as a professional intelligence officer who had known exactly what he was doing and had made a calculated choice to betray the trust of the country that had granted him residence. Michael Brennan pleaded guilty as part of his cooperation agreement and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. He was released in 1999 and lived the remainder of his life in obscurity, avoiding media attention and refusing to discuss his role in the case. Kuznetsov never served his full sentence. In 1986, as part of a prisoner exchange negotiated through diplomatic channels during a brief thaw in Cold War tensions, he was released and returned to the Soviet Union in exchange for an American intelligence officer who had been arrested in Eastern Europe on espionage charges. He disappeared back into the Soviet intelligence apparatus, and while there were occasional rumors over the years that he had been promoted within the KGB for his service, nothing was ever confirmed. The case became a significant example in FBI counterintelligence training used to illustrate how deep cover operatives could be identified through careful analysis of inconsistencies and behavioral patterns, and how the simplest mistakes, like losing a wallet, could unravel years of careful operational security. Raymond Torres, the custodian who had found the wallet in the parking garage, was never informed about the significance of what he discovered. He continued working at the Tysons Corner office complex for another 15 years before retiring in 1998, never knowing that his simple act of turning in lost property had triggered one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the 1980s. The wallet itself, preserved as evidence and later declassified, is now part of an FBI museum collection dedicated to Cold War espionage. It sits in a display case alongside the forged business card, the photograph of the woman and children who were never identified and may have been complete fabrications, and a small placard explaining how this ordinary object became the thread that unraveled a Soviet intelligence operation. For years after Kuznetsov's arrest, FBI counterintelligence analysts debated how he had lost the wallet and why he had been carrying forged credentials in the first place when his cover as Daniel Chambers should have made them unnecessary. The most likely explanation, supported by analysis of his behavioral patterns, was that the forged business card was meant to be a backup credential, something he could use if questioned in certain contexts about his professional background. The wallet may have been lost during a meeting with an asset or during a surveillance detection run, routine activities that would have required him to move through parking garages and public spaces where a wallet could easily fall from a pocket. What's certain is that Kuznetsov, despite his training and his operational discipline, made the kind of small human error that even the most careful intelligence officers eventually make. And in the world of espionage, where success often depends on maintaining perfect operational security over years or decades, a single mistake can be enough. The loss of a wallet, an object so ordinary that millions of people lose them every year without consequence, became in this case the beginning of the end for an operation that had been running successfully for more than a decade. The case also highlighted the importance of the network of FBI informants and cooperative personnel embedded in defense contractors and security-sensitive facilities throughout the Washington area. Robert Haskins, the security director who had first recognized the significance of the forged business card, received a commendation from the FBI for his role in initiating the investigation. His alertness to the anomaly, his decision to contact the Bureau rather than dismissing the wallet as a simple lost property matter, exemplified the kind of vigilance that counterintelligence operations depend on. In the broader context of Cold War espionage, the Kuznetsov case represented one of many successful deep cover operations that the Soviet Union ran in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s. These illegals, intelligence officers who lived under false identities for years, represented some of the KGB's most valuable assets because they could operate without the restrictions and surveillance that affected Soviet diplomats and other personnel who were known to American counterintelligence. The challenge of identifying and neutralizing these deep cover operatives consumed enormous resources
and required the kind of patient, methodical investigation that characterized the Kuznetsov case. The FBI's success in this instance was built on careful analysis, disciplined surveillance, and the willingness to invest time and effort in pursuing leads that might have seemed insignificant. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought many Cold War espionage operations to light, as archives were opened and former intelligence officers began speaking more openly about their activities. But the full extent of Kuznetsov's network, the number of other assets he may have recruited, and the total damage caused by his espionage activities remain partially classified to this day. What is known is that he was considered one of the more successful Soviet illegals to operate in the United States during the latter years of the Cold War, and that his exposure dealt a significant blow to KGB operations in the Washington area. The story of how a lost wallet exposed Pyotr Kuznetsov is ultimately a story about the intersection of human error and institutional vigilance. It illustrates how even the most sophisticated intelligence operations can be undone by the smallest mistakes, and how success in counterintelligence often depends not on dramatic confrontations or breakthrough technologies, but on the careful attention to detail of ordinary people doing their jobs. Raymond Torres. Emptying trash bins in a parking garage. Robert Haskins, recognizing that a business card didn't match his company's records. FBI agents patiently watching a townhouse night after night. These were the unglamorous realities of Cold War espionage, far removed from the popular image of spy thrillers and action films. And it was these realities, this patient accumulation of small observations and careful analysis, that eventually brought down a Soviet intelligence officer who had spent 12 years building a life and a legend that should have been unbreakable. The wallet that started it all, that ordinary brown leather wallet found in a parking garage on a November morning, stands as a reminder that in the secret war between nations, the most dangerous weapons are often the most mundane, and the most effective defenses are the ones that never let down their guard, not even for something as simple as a piece of lost property.